single mom rescues a child from danger, only to learn his father is a billionaire CEO. Greetings from Heart Story HQ. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We hope you enjoy the story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. What if a single act of kindness changed the course of your life forever? A moment so simple, so pure, yet powerful enough to shatter everything you thought you knew about love, destiny, and the very fabric of your existence. For Samantha, a young single mom doing everything she could to make life work for her and her son, one fateful decision would lead her down a path she never could have imagined. It was the kind of day you could easily forget ordinary, without any signs of the unexpected. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting shadows over the quiet neighborhood. Samantha had just finished her shift at the local hospital, the exhaustion weighing heavily on her shoulders, but she kept moving. Her thoughts were wrapped in the daily grind, bills, groceries, cleaning up the mess of another chaotic week. She didn't have the luxury of dwelling on what was missing in her life. She didn't have time to long for something more. But there was something about the way her son Ethan looked up at her every night, his wide eyes full of trust and hope, that reminded her why she kept pushing. Walking him home that evening, she barely noticed the world around her, until it happened. One second, the streets were calm, the world spinning on its usual axis, and the next, everything stopped. A child, no older than her own, darted into the street. His tiny form appeared out of nowhere, rushing in front of a car that was speeding, uncaring, too fast. Samantha's heart froze. Time seemed to slow, but there was no hesitation in her. Instinctively, she pushed the child aside, her body colliding with his just seconds before the car's tires screeched, missing them by a breath. The impact left her breathless, but the boy, he was safe. Her heart was released. The boy was safe. She said she knew it even before she had a chance to check. He was shaken, of course, frightened, but alive. A gasp escaped her lips, but there was no time to reflect on the terror that had just unfolded. She helped him to his feet, her heart still racing as she checked him over for any sign of injury. But in that moment, all that mattered was that he was safe. She could feel her legs trembling, the weight of the near miss sinking in, but she steadied herself. She'd done what needed to be done. Before she could catch her breath, a sleek black car screeched to a halt right beside them. The doors swung open and out stepped a man. Tall, confident, dressed in a tailored suit that screamed wealth and power. His sharp eyes locked onto Samantha first, then shifted to the child she had just saved. I owe you everything," the man said, his voice steady but filled with a sincerity that surprised her. "You saved my son." He stepped closer, his gaze softening as he inspected the boy, who was now standing beside her, still clutching her hand. Samantha shook her head. "It was nothing. I couldn't just stand by." The man's expression softened, but there was something more, something in the way he watched her that she couldn't quite place. A flicker of gratitude, yes, but also something deeper. Something that suggested this wasn't just an ordinary meeting. "I'm Richard Devereaux," he introduced himself, "and this is my son, Alex. If there's anything I can do to thank you—" "Really, it's fine," Samantha cut him off, not wanting to seem as though she was looking for anything in return. But before she could make her exit, Richard was already insisting, his tone firm, like he wasn't accustomed to hearing the word no. "Let me take you both out to dinner. It's the least I can do after what you did for us." Samantha hesitated. She had never been one to accept charity or even favors from anyone, let alone a complete stranger. But the gratitude in his voice was so genuine, and the way Alex, his son, was looking at her, as if he had just been saved from the very hands of fate itself, made her think twice, and so she agreed. What harm could there be in a simple dinner? What harm could there be in this chance encounter with a man who, for all his wealth, seemed to be just another person, perhaps in need of something she had to offer, a kind word, a moment of connection. But little did she know, this seemingly innocent evening would mark the beginning of a change in her life, one she wasn't prepared for. A life that had once been simple, predictable, would soon be turned upside down. For Samantha, this one act of kindness, the simple decision to help a child, was the start of something that would blur the lines between right and wrong, love and fear, and expose her to a world she never thought she would be part of. What she didn't know was that Richard Devereaux wasn't just any man. He was a billionaire, the the CEO of a powerful empire, a man whose world revolved around money, influence, and control. But behind that polished exterior, there was a man who, much like her, had spent years guarding his heart, hiding from the truth of his loneliness, and building walls so high that even the strongest storms couldn't reach him. But then, fate had its way. And Samantha? Well, she was about to learn that sometimes, even the smallest act of kindness can set off a chain of events that forces you to question everything you thought you knew about yourself, about love, about fate. The dinner would change everything. But how could she know then, how could she have known, that one simple moment would open the door to a world full of riches and heartbreak, opportunity and loss, love and betrayal? How could she have known that the man standing in front of her, thanking her for a simple act, would be the one who would change the course of her life forever? All she knew was that in that moment, standing in the street with a boy she didn't know, she had saved a life. And in doing so, she had unknowingly stepped into a world where everything, even her future, would never be the same. How much could one moment change? How much could one decision shape the rest of your life? For Samantha, it was the beginning of a story she couldn't have possibly imagined. But what she would soon discover, what neither she nor Richard was prepared for, was that kindness once given can never truly be undone. And sometimes, it is the quietest decisions that shake the world to its core. This was only the beginning, and neither Samantha nor Richard could have predicted where it would lead. Samantha's world, at its core, was built on love. Love for Ethan, her 6-year-old son, whose infectious laughter could light up any room, whose tiny hands wrapped around hers at night made her feel like there was still hope in the world. But love, as beautiful and constant as it was, wasn't enough to shield her from the weight of her life. The world she lived in was one where every decision was driven by necessity, where time seemed to slip away faster than she could grasp it. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it was hers. The mornings always started before the sun had fully risen. The alarm clock blared at 5:30 a.m., a sound that had become a cruel reminder of the long, exhausting day ahead. Samantha's eyes fluttered open, her body still aching from the long shifts at the hospital the night before. The smell of coffee filled the air, and as her feet hit the cold wooden floor, she braced herself for another day of routine. Her first task was always the same: get Ethan ready for school. He was a bright boy, eager to go to class, but like most kids his age, his mornings were filled with the usual reluctance to leave the warmth of the bed. Samantha smiled softly as she walked into his room. The sight of him still wrapped in his blanket, his tousled hair poking out from under the covers. She sat down on the edge of his bed and gently shook his shoulder.
Ethan, I'm gonna go with our time now. Time to get up, buddy,
she whispered, her voice tender but firm. He groaned, pulling the covers tighter around himself. 5 more minutes, Mom, he mumbled, his little face scrunching up in protest. Samantha chuckled softly, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. 5 minutes turns into 20 and you'll miss the bus, she teased, her voice carrying the warmth of a mother who'd been through this same routine countless times before. Reluctantly, Ethan opened his eyes, still half dazed but smiling up at her. Good morning, Mom. Good morning, love, she replied, giving him a quick kiss on the cheek. Come on, time to get dressed. We've got a busy day ahead. As Ethan sluggishly climbed out of bed, Samantha made her way to the kitchen. The early morning light filtered through the blinds, casting soft shadows on the countertops. Her kitchen was modest, a small space filled with mismatched dishes and the faint scent of burnt toast that seemed to cling to the air. She had little time to make a full breakfast, so she quickly scrambled together eggs and toast. There were no luxuries here, just enough to get them through the day. As she placed the plate of food in front of Ethan, she couldn't help but notice the quiet sadness in her heart. The financial strain had been wearing her down for months. She worked as a nurse at the local hospital, pulling long shifts in the ER. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but it paid the bills. Barely. There were days when she felt like she was just barely treading water, drowning in bills, student loans, and the pressure of being a single mom. She didn't have the luxury of a perfect family life. Ethan's father had left them before Ethan was born, and the emotional toll of that abandonment still lingered in her heart. He had promised he'd always be there, but the moment the responsibility of fatherhood arrived, he disappeared without a trace. Yet despite all of that, Samantha never allowed her son to see her weaknesses. She never let him feel the full weight of her struggles. Samantha double-checked that Ethan had everything he needed for school. homework, lunch, and the little keychain he insisted on bringing with him every day. She had long since stopped thinking about her own needs. It was all about him. He was the priority. The drive to school was short, but it was always bittersweet for Samantha. As she dropped him off at the entrance of the school, she couldn't help but feel a pang in her chest, a quiet longing for the things she couldn't give him. She watched him run toward his friends, his backpack bouncing with each step, and she smiled, but there was a sadness in her eyes. She wanted so badly to give him the world, the kind of life where he didn't have to worry about anything, the kind of life where he could simply be a child. But that was a dream she couldn't afford to chase. The drive to the hospital was filled with quiet contemplation. The radio played softly, but Samantha's thoughts consumed her, the same thoughts that had been there for weeks. How could she ever give Ethan the life he deserved? How could she keep up with this pace? She felt isolated in her struggles, like a small boat adrift in a vast ocean, drifting farther from the shore with each passing day. She'd heard people say that things would get easier, that it would all pay off in the end, but that didn't seem to be true for her. Each day she felt more exhausted, more worn down. The weight of it all threatened to pull her under. She had always prided herself on being strong, on being able to handle whatever came her way. But the longer she went without a break, the more she questioned if she could keep going. She parked her car in the hospital lot, gathering her things. The hospital was bustling, the steady rhythm of beeping machines and hurried footsteps filling the air. She'd done this 1,000 times before, but today felt different. She felt disconnected, like she was moving through the motions without truly being there. At the nurse's station, she was handed a stack of patient files. She plastered a smile on her face and took a deep breath. Another long day ahead, but as she walked down the sterile hallways of the ER, her mind kept drifting back to Ethan, to his bright eyes and the way he clung to her every word. He didn't know it, but he was the reason she kept going. He was the reason she still believed in the possibility of something better. But no matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she gave of herself, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. She dreamed of a life where she didn't have to worry about bills, where she could give Ethan the things he deserved. Dance classes, a new pair of shoes without feeling guilty, a family that didn't feel like an incomplete puzzle. But those dreams felt so far out of reach, like stars she couldn't touch. As the hours wore on in the hospital, the work never slowed. Every patient, every procedure was a reminder of the toll it was taking on her. The exhaustion, the burnout, the relentless pressure of being a single mother, a full-time nurse, and the only provider for her child, it was starting to weigh on her soul. The hours passed, but there was no relief in sight. By the time she finished her shift, it was late. She picked Ethan up from the after-school program, his small figure running to greet her, his face lighting up with a smile that reminded her once again why she did it all. "How was school, buddy?" she asked, her voice filled with warmth despite the exhaustion hanging over her. "Great! We learned about space today," Ethan replied, bouncing up and down. "Space, huh?" Samantha smiled, feeling a flicker of joy. "Did you learn anything cool?" "Yeah. Did you know the sun is a star?" Ethan said, his eyes wide with excitement. "I want to be an astronaut when I grow up." Samantha's heart swelled with pride. Ethan had dreams, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a spark of hope in herself. He deserved to follow those dreams. He deserved the world, but the reality was she couldn't give him that world. Not yet. As they drove home, the weight of the day pressed down on Samantha again. She longed for something more, for a break, for an end to the constant struggle. But the one thing she held on to was the love she shared with Ethan. She would keep going, no matter what, for him. Always for him. And yet, somewhere in the depths of her heart, Samantha couldn't help but wonder if, just once, her life could take a turn. Could it ever be different? Could a single moment, one simple act of kindness, be the key to unlocking the future she had always dreamed of? Samantha's journey to becoming a single mom was far from simple, though it was shaped by the same kind of love, hope, and ultimately heartbreak that defined so many aspects of her life. It all began years before Ethan was born, when Samantha was still a teenager, full of dreams and expectations for the future. Back then, she had just moved into the city with her mother, leaving the small town she'd grown up in, hoping for a new start. The city was a place of endless possibilities, or so it seemed to a young girl with big dreams and an even bigger heart. In high school, Samantha met David, a boy who seemed to understand her in a way no one else did. He was charming, with an easy smile and a way of making everything feel right. He wasn't the most popular, but he had something about him, a quiet confidence that drew Samantha in. She wasn't looking for anything serious at first, just a connection, a little fun. But over time, they grew closer. David listened to her with an intensity that made her feel heard, and he made her feel important in a world where she sometimes felt invisible. They talked about everything, the future, their dreams, what they wanted to do after graduation. And when they shared their first kiss, it was as if the whole world had stopped just for them. It wasn't long before Samantha discovered she was pregnant. The news hit like a thunderclap. At first there was shock, followed by an overwhelming sense of confusion. The moment the pregnancy test confirmed her fears, her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Uncertainty, fear, and doubt. She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't even sure she wanted it. But deep down, something shifted. This little life growing inside her was her responsibility now. She couldn't back away, no matter how frightened she was. David at first promised everything. He assured her that they would make it work, that he'd stand by her side. He told her they would raise this baby together, that it was going to be okay. Samantha believed him, despite the fear gnawing at her heart. After all, love was supposed to be enough, wasn't it? But as the months went by, cracks began to show. The late-night talks about the future slowly turned into silence. David started to withdraw. He missed more and more of Samantha's doctor appointments, and when he did show up, his enthusiasm seemed to dwindle. His friends began to distance themselves from him, and soon it was clear that David wasn't the person he once was. By the time Samantha reached her 3rd trimester, David had stopped coming around altogether. He had told her he was busy, that he needed time to figure things out. He'd promised he'd come back, but the weeks stretched into months, and there was no word from him. His phone calls became less frequent, until finally they stopped altogether. Samantha tried everything, calling, texting, reaching out to his family, but no one had answers. The man who had once been so eager to take on this responsibility had vanished without a trace. The reality of her situation hit her with full force. The boy she had trusted, the one who had promised her everything, was gone. He had left her pregnant and alone, a teenager with dreams of a future that now seemed impossible to reach. The pain of betrayal and abandonment seared through her, leaving her heartbroken. But there was no time to wallow in the hurt. She was carrying a child, Ethan, who needed her more than anything. And so, she picked up the pieces of her broken heart, put one foot in front of the other, and made a choice. She would be enough for her son. She would give him everything she had, even if it meant sacrificing everything else. She never saw David again. She never got any closure, no explanation for why he left, no apology. He was gone, and the future she had once imagined with him evaporated as quickly as he did. But Samantha didn't let that break her. She couldn't afford to. She had a child to raise, and she would do it alone if she had to. As her pregnancy progressed, Samantha leaned on her mother for support. Her mother, though weary from her own struggles, stepped up in ways Samantha didn't know she needed. They made do with what they had. They spent hours planning the nursery, picking out baby clothes, and dreaming about the future, even though Samantha had no idea what it would look like. She worked at a local diner to save money for baby essentials, but deep down, she was terrified. How could she provide for her child when she couldn't even figure out how to pay her own bills? When Ethan was born, Samantha knew she had to become someone else. The girl who had dreams of a different kind of life was gone, replaced by a mother who had to grow up quickly, who had to be strong even when every part of her felt weak. She learned how to change diapers in the middle of the night, how to nurse on demand, and how to survive on just a few hours of sleep. She watched Ethan's little face light up with each new discovery. His first smile, his first word, and she realized that no matter how difficult this journey had been, it was worth it. Ethan gave her a reason to keep going when the world seemed to be falling apart. But the isolation that came with being a single mom weighed heavily on Samantha. There were days when she felt like an island, like no one truly understood what it was like to be in her shoes. She had friends, of course, but they didn't know what it was like to carry the weight of raising a child alone, to worry about how to make ends meet, to be the sole protector of someone who depended on her for everything. The longing for a partner, someone to share the burden, to offer comfort, to help make decisions, never went away. There were nights when she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what her life would have been like if David had stayed, if things had turned out differently. But those thoughts were fleeting. What mattered now was Ethan, and she would give him the best life she could, even if it meant sacrificing her own happiness. Ethan said that being a single mom wasn't easy, but it was the only life Samantha knew, and in the deepest corners of her heart, she believed that one day, somehow, things would be different. She didn't know how or when, but she held on to the hope that life would open up in ways she couldn't yet see. For now, she simply focused on loving Ethan, doing everything she could to be the best mother she could be, even if that meant doing it all alone. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a long, uncertain journey. But in the quiet moments, when she held Ethan close, she knew one thing for sure. No matter what, she would always be there for him, even if she had to do it alone. Samantha's life was a relentless cycle, each day folding into the next with barely a moment to breathe. Every time she woke up, the world felt like it was pressing in from all sides. Ethan's needs, so simple, so pure, demanded her time, her focus, and her heart, but there was always something more she had to give. Bills, grocery lists, errands. The constant ticking of the clock that seemed to move faster every day. By the time she got home from work, it was already dark. It was a never-ending race against time, a race she felt she was losing. Her job as a nurse at the local hospital drained her physically and emotionally. The ER was a place where chaos and calm existed in equal measure. Samantha was a seasoned professional, quick on her feet, composed in a crisis, but no matter how much she helped others, she could never seem to shake the exhaustion that clung to her like a second skin. The long shifts took everything she had, and when it was over, there was never any time to rest. Ethan still needed her. He needed the bedtime stories, the comforting hugs when he had a bad dream, the support at his school events. The guilt of never being able to be fully present, to be fully rested, wore on her. She was always tired, but she couldn't afford to show it. In the dim glow of the living room, after Ethan had fallen asleep, Samantha would sit in silence, surrounded by the papers, bills, receipts, overdue notices, and stare at the small stack of letters with her name on them. The student loan bills, the credit card statements that mocked her with their high balances. There was a deep sense of shame that accompanied every bill that came through the door. She wasn't doing enough. She wasn't earning enough to get ahead. Every month was a struggle to make ends meet. Sometimes she would lay in bed at night, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding. "Am I doing enough?" she would ask herself, her voice barely a whisper in the quiet of the night. "Am I a good enough mom?" The questions haunted her, pulling at the edges of her resolve, making her wonder if her best was truly good enough. Would Ethan grow up resenting her? Would he ever understand the sacrifices she made, the tears she'd shed when no one was around to see them? At times, the weight of it all made her feel as if she were sinking. There were days when it felt like she was drowning in a sea of responsibility, where the responsibilities of work, parenthood, and survival collided. And yet, no matter how overwhelmed she felt, she couldn't stop. She had to keep going. There was no other choice. Ethan's future was in her hands. But sometimes, the pressure would get to be too much. There were days when she snapped. When the stress of work, the burden of being everything to Ethan, the fear that she wasn't doing enough would spill over in a moment of frustration. The weight of a long shift, the exhaustion from staying up late helping Ethan with his homework, would catch up with her in the quiet of their small apartment. One evening, after a particularly brutal day at the hospital, Samantha collapsed onto the couch, her eyes raw from the constant strain. Ethan had fallen asleep early, exhausted from the day at school, and Samantha sat in the silence, trying to catch her breath. The only sound in the room was the soft hum of the refrigerator, the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. She was so tired, and yet the quiet was unsettling. It felt like her life was slipping through her fingers. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, and she picked it up, blinking at the unfamiliar number. It was Ava, her best friend from high school, someone she had known for years but hadn't seen much of since the days before Ethan was born. Ava was one of the few people who knew about the pressures Samantha faced, but even Ava didn't truly understand what it felt like to be in her shoes. Ava had a career, a life that seemed to unfold neatly, while Samantha's life was messy and unpredictable. "Hey Sam, how's everything going?" Ava's voice came through the phone, warm but full of concern. Samantha sighed, rubbing her eyes. "Honestly, I don't know, it's just everything, Work's been insane and I feel like I'm failing. I can't keep up with it all, Ava. I'm so tired. I'm not sure I'm even being a good mom anymore." There was a long pause on the other end, a silence that stretched, making Samantha feel exposed. Ava, always the practical one, had a way of offering solutions, but this time there was no fix, no easy answer. Finally, Ava spoke, her voice quieter than usual. "Sam, I get it. I do, but you're not failing. You're doing the best you can. And that's all Ethan needs. Your best. You're a great mom, but you have to give yourself some credit. You don't have to be perfect." Tears welled up in Samantha's eyes as she let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. It wasn't the first time she had heard those words. Everyone said the same thing. "You're doing the best you can. You're a great mom." But the reassurance always felt hollow, like she was convincing herself more than anyone else. "I just wish I could give him more," Samantha murmured, her voice breaking. "He deserves more than this. I can't even give him the things I've always wanted to. He's growing up in a world where we don't have much, and I don't know if I can keep up." The floodgates opened and the tears came pouring out. Ava was silent on the other end, her presence felt in the quiet hum of the phone, as if she was there, sitting next to Samantha, even though miles separated them. The emotional exhaustion Samantha had been holding in for so long was finally spilling over. "I just want him to be happy. I want him to have what I couldn't, but I can barely make ends meet. I don't want him to feel this weight, this worry. It's too much, Ava. Sometimes I wonder if he'd be better off with someone else, someone who could give him more." Ava's voice came through softer now, the worry clear in her tone. "Sam, listen to me. Ethan doesn't need more in the material sense. He needs you, your love, your presence, your guidance. And you give him that every day. You're his everything, don't ever think otherwise." The next morning, as Samantha kissed Ethan goodbye and sent him off to school, she felt a renewed sense of determination. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know what the future would hold, but in that moment she knew she would keep going. She would fight for Ethan, for their future, even when the world felt like it was pushing her down. Because, at the end of the day, all she had to give was her best, and that was all Ethan needed. The high-rise building that housed Devereaux Enterprises stood tall and imposing, a symbol of the wealth and power Richard Devereaux had spent decades building. From his glass-walled corner office on the 42nd floor, Richard had a panoramic view of the city he had helped shape with his ambition and vision. The world below him was one he controlled. He had made sure of that. Every deal, every merger, every business decision was his to make, and his employees moved like cogs in the well-oiled machine that was Devereaux Enterprises. Inside that office, Richard sat at his sleek, dark wood desk, a polished symbol of his success, while a group of executives stood around him. Their voices buzzed like the sound of a distant storm, the weight of their words falling on his shoulders. The presentation on the screen behind him showcased projections and figures that promised yet another profitable quarter. But Richard's mind wasn't on the numbers. It hadn't been for a long time. The team continued to speak, presenting their reports, but Richard's focus wavered. His sharp eyes, typically the epitome of control, now seemed distant, almost absent. He nodded at the right moments, interjected when necessary, but inside he was somewhere far away, lost in memories he couldn't escape. The meeting wrapped up, and one by one the executives filtered out of the room, leaving Richard alone. The silence that settled over the office was almost unbearable. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the vast skyline beyond the glass, but his mind was far from the success his company had achieved. Richard Devereaux wasn't always this way. There was a time when his life had been filled with laughter, warmth, and the love of his wife, Lily. She was the light that balanced out the darkness of his relentless ambition. Lily had been more than just his partner. She had been his anchor, his moral compass, the woman who could always bring him back from the edge when he grew too obsessed with work. Together, they had built Devereaux Enterprises from the ground up, each of them playing an integral part in its success. Richard had the vision and the drive, but Lily had the insight, the creativity, the soul that made their business feel more like a calling than a transaction. Lily was the one who had pushed Richard to dream bigger, to expand into markets he never would have considered. She was the one who insisted they take risks, knowing full well that the potential for failure was high. But she believed in them, in the power of their partnership, and her unwavering faith had kept Richard grounded. They were a team, each filling in the gaps where the other faltered. It had been a perfect balance. Until the accident. One rainy night, just a year ago, their lives had been changed forever. Richard had been working late at the office, immersed in the details of a deal that could secure his company's future for decades. Lily had been out with friends, as she often was on Friday nights, catching up with old colleagues over dinner. Richard had been planning to meet her afterward, but the phone call came before he could even finish his last email. The voice on the other end was shaky, desperate, and barely coherent. An accident, a car wreck. Lily had been caught in the crash. She hadn't survived. The world as Richard knew it shattered in that moment. The woman who had been his partner, his best friend, was gone, taken from him in an instant. The crash had been a random tragedy. An out-of-control vehicle had skidded across the wet road and collided with Lily's car head-on. The doctors told him that if she had been wearing her seatbelt, she might have survived, but she hadn't, and so she didn't. Richard hadn't been able to understand it. He still couldn't. How could it happen? The one person who had given his life meaning, gone in a second. And with her death, Richard felt himself fall into a void he could not climb out of. For months, he threw himself into work, hoping that by burying his grief in deals and contracts, he could somehow fill the emptiness. But it was all in vain. His wealth, his accomplishments, none of it felt real anymore. He had everything anyone could want. Power, influence, respect. But it was all hollow. The money didn't matter, the title didn't matter, nothing mattered without Lily. After her death, Richard had become a shell of the man he once was. His colleagues saw the change, but none of them dared to say anything. They didn't know how to approach him. And truthfully, neither did he. He had lost his will to connect, to feel the joy he once had when he was with her. Instead, he became distant and cold, emotionally numb, shutting himself off from the world that had once held so much meaning. It wasn't just the business that had lost its sparkle. It was everything. Even his relationship with his son Alex had changed. Alex, now 10, had been a sweet boy, quiet, sensitive, and far more intuitive than Richard had realized. After Lily's death, Richard tried to be there for him, but it wasn't the same. Richard found himself unable to connect with his son the way he once had. He had become consumed by his own grief, unable to offer the comfort and support that Alex needed. The loss of Lily was a wound they both carried, but in different ways. Richard's pain was silent, internal, like a weight on his chest that never left, while Alex wore his grief more openly, retreating into himself, becoming more withdrawn. Richard felt guilty for not being the father Alex needed. He had promised Lily that he would protect their son, but he hadn't been able to protect himself from the loneliness that had consumed him after her death. Every time he looked at Alex, he saw the face of his wife. The woman he loved, the woman who had completed him. And that only deepened the pain. At night, when the house was still, Richard would sometimes find himself sitting by the window, staring out at the city lights, wishing for the one thing that money couldn't buy: a second chance. He would close his eyes and imagine what life would have been like if Lily were still here. He imagined her laughter filling the house, the sound of her voice as they made dinner together, the way she always knew just what to say when he was overwhelmed. He couldn't even remember the last time he'd laughed. The weight of that silence was unbearable, and yet he had everything anyone could want. He had money, power, influence. He had a business empire that spanned continents and employees who looked up to him. People respected him. But when he was alone, in the silence of his office or his home, none of it mattered. His wealth felt like an insult to the life he had lost. His wife, was this the price of success? A life of emptiness? Does wealth really matter when the person you love is gone? Will Richard ever find happiness again, or is he destined to be alone? These questions haunted him, and despite all his accomplishments, he couldn't find an answer. The one thing that kept him going, however, was Alex. He was all Richard had left of Lily. He was her legacy. But no matter how hard Richard tried to reach him, there was always a distance between them, a wall they couldn't seem to climb. Richard tried, but he didn't know how to help his son through the pain. How could he? He hadn't even helped himself. But there was still something inside of Richard, something buried deep beneath the surface. Hope. a hope that perhaps, just perhaps, things could get better. He couldn't let Alex grow up without a father who was whole, who was able to guide him through the tough moments. He couldn't let his son suffer because of his own inability to heal. Richard had built his life on decisions, on control. But now the hardest decision of all was to allow himself to open up again. To allow someone in, to heal from the pain. He wasn't sure he was ready for that, but he had to try, for Alex, for himself. And little did he know, the universe was about to make him face his grief head-on in a way he never expected. A single mother, her selfless act of kindness would be the first step toward the healing he so desperately needed. His fear of vulnerability kept him trapped in his own bubble, surrounded by wealth but isolated in his grief. Could he ever let someone in again? Could he ever allow himself to feel truly connected to another person, to trust someone with his heart? The idea of opening up to anyone, especially after the heartbreak he had endured, seemed impossible. Would he ever truly find happiness again? Or was he destined to be alone, clinging to the memory of a life that could never return? But the more Richard pushed these questions to the back of his mind, the more they crept into his thoughts. The distance he had placed between himself and the world was suffocating him, and the weight of it all was beginning to take its toll. As he sat in the boardroom, listening to another report, he couldn't help but wonder if this life, this lonely, successful existence, was really all there was. Back in Samantha's world, moments of joy and relief were still fleeting. Life seemed to throw her one curveball after another. She found herself at the hospital again, working late into the night. The fluorescent lights buzzed above her as she worked through another exhausting shift, her hands numb from the constant motions, her thoughts drifting to Ethan. A sudden call came through on her phone, interrupting her tired thoughts. It was a number she didn't recognize. She sighed, knowing it was likely just another bill collector, but something told her to answer it anyway. "Samantha? Hi, this is Linda from the hospital administration," the voice on the other end said, the sound of papers rustling in the background. "We've been following your work, and we think you have a lot of potential here. There's a position opening up for a supervising nurse. We'd like to offer you the job if you're interested." For a moment, Samantha just stood there blinking at the phone, the weight of the offer sinking in. It was a huge opportunity. A promotion, a chance for more stability, more money. But as quickly as the excitement surged, doubt crept in. Could she handle it? Could she balance it all? Ethan needed her so much, and what if this new role meant even longer hours, even more time away from
Linda,
I don't know. I'm grateful for the offer, but I don't know if I can take on more right now, Samantha said, her voice faltering slightly. There was a pause on the other end, then Linda's voice softened. "I understand, but you've been doing amazing work and you deserve this opportunity. Think about it, okay?" As Samantha hung up, the weight of the decision hung over her. What was she afraid of? Was it fear of failure? Or was it that no matter how much she worked to improve their life, she still couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't doing enough for Ethan? She put her phone away and for a brief moment allowed herself to just close her eyes and breathe. Maybe she could make it work. Maybe this was the change she needed to finally get ahead, to give Ethan the life she dreamed of. But it wouldn't be easy. Nothing ever was. For Richard, the internal battle continued. Late one evening, he found himself alone in his penthouse, staring out at the city lights. He hadn't expected to feel this way, so empty, so cold. His phone vibrated on the table next to him. It was Alex, asking if they could have dinner together the next night. Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. He missed his son, missed the days when Alex would run into his arms after school, when their evenings were filled with laughter and conversation. But now, Alex's distance was palpable. Richard didn't know how to bridge that gap. He didn't know how to be the father Alex needed, how to be the man he used to be before the grief took over. Still, he agreed to the dinner, the thought of spending even a small amount of time with his son stirring something inside him, a flicker of hope. It was something, at least. He sent the text confirming the plans, and as he set the phone down, he felt the weight of his own solitude settle in once again. But maybe, he thought, maybe this time it could be different. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, and the city streets buzzed with the usual chaos of commuters and busy pedestrians. Samantha was walking Ethan home from school, their laughter filling the air as they talked about his day. Despite the challenges they faced, these small moments of joy, like walking hand in hand with her son, always made Samantha feel like everything would be okay, even if just for a little while. It was these fleeting moments of peace she held on to, like a lifeline amidst the constant struggle. The park they usually walked through was quiet today, the grass wet from a morning rainstorm, leaves swirling in the air like golden confetti. Samantha could feel the weight of exhaustion in her bones, the tiredness she had learned to live with. But Ethan was full of energy, running ahead of her as he kicked a ball toward the far corner of the park. She called out to him, her voice soft but with a note of warning.
Don't wander too far, Ethan,
she called, her eyes following his every movement. Ethan turned and grinned, nodding enthusiastically before running back to retrieve the ball. But before he could reach it, something caught Samantha's eye. An unfamiliar figure darting across the park, heading straight toward the street. Her heart stopped. She shouted, instinctively recognizing the child. It was Alex Devereaux, Richard's son, who had somehow managed to slip away from his father's watchful eyes. Samantha's heart raced as she watched Alex's small body move faster than she had anticipated. Before she could even blink, he was already halfway to the street. Her instincts kicked in, her motherly reflexes honed over years of raising Ethan. Without thinking, she leaped forward, grabbing Alex just as the car screeched toward them. The impact of her body crashing into his sent them both tumbling into the grass just out of reach of the vehicle. The world snapped back into focus, and Samantha's heart pounded in her chest as she pushed Alex off of her, making sure he was okay. She looked him over quickly, her eyes scanning for any signs of injury, but to her relief, he was unharmed, shaking but alive. Tears stung at the back of her eyes, but she forced them back, trying to steady her breath. "Are you all right?" she asked urgently, her voice trembling slightly from the shock. Alex's wide, scared eyes met hers, his small body trembling with the realization of just how close he had come to danger. He nodded shakily, too stunned to speak. Samantha helped him sit up, pulling him closer to her as she continued to check him over for any injuries. But just as she was about to stand, the screeching of tires broke the air again, this time louder and more frantic. The car that had been heading toward them slammed on the brakes, and the sound of the engine shutting off filled the air. Richard Devereaux, looking more frantic than Samantha had ever seen a man, leaped out of the car before it even came to a full stop. His sharp suit, so out of place in the midst of this chaos, was wrinkled and disheveled. His eyes scanned the park desperately, landing on his son in an instant. Alex shouted, running toward them. The panic in his voice was unmistakable as he fell to his knees beside Alex. His eyes locked onto Samantha, filled with gratitude as he brushed his son's hair away from his face. Thank you so much." Richard's voice cracked with emotion, his hands shaking as he reached for his son. "I don't know what would have happened if—" Samantha, still catching her breath, managed a soft smile. "It's okay, he's fine. I'm just glad I got to him in time." She stood back, letting Richard hold his son tightly, trying to steady herself as her body shook from the adrenaline. Alex, still dazed, was clinging to his father now, and Samantha couldn't help but feel the weight of what had just transpired. She had saved the boy, yes, but more than that. She had done something she would never have expected. Her reflexes had kicked in without hesitation, and in that instant, she had been there for a child who wasn't even hers. Richard stood up, still holding Alex, his eyes never leaving Samantha. There was a look of awe in his eyes, as though he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. He took a breath and then, almost reluctantly, spoke again. "Please, let me thank you properly." Richard's voice softened, his usual corporate demeanor replaced with something raw and vulnerable. "You saved my son. I can't even imagine what might have happened if you hadn't been there. Can I take you and Ethan to dinner? A meal, at least, to show my gratitude?" Samantha hesitated for a moment. The idea of accepting anything from a stranger, especially someone as wealthy as Richard Devereaux, felt uncomfortable. She wasn't someone who usually accepted charity or favors. She had had enough experience to know that people with money didn't often understand what it was like to struggle. But there was something in Richard's eyes, genuine, grateful, and unexpectedly warm, that made her reconsider. I suppose we could have dinner," Samantha said, her voice soft. "But I don't want to make a big deal out of this," Richard smiled, the tension in his face easing. "It's not a big deal, it's just, I owe you this." The invitation was unexpected, and Samantha felt a mixture of curiosity and caution. She didn't belong in Richard's world, she was just a single mom trying to survive. She didn't know what someone like him would want with someone like her, but the genuine appreciation in his eyes gave her pause, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the possibility of something new on the horizon. Over dinner, the evening took on an unexpected rhythm. Richard had chosen a quiet restaurant, nothing too flashy but still elegant, with soft lighting and a welcoming atmosphere. They were seated at a corner table, away from the bustling crowd, and there was something about the calmness of the setting that allowed both of them to relax, if only for a little while. Samantha couldn't help but observe how different Richard was from the image she had initially built up in her mind. He wasn't the cold, distant billionaire she had expected. Instead, as they ate, he asked about Ethan, listened to her stories about her life, about how hard it had been raising a son alone, about the endless struggle to balance work and motherhood. And Richard, surprisingly, was just as open. He talked about Alex, about how difficult it had been after his wife Lily passed away. He spoke of his regrets, his inability to connect with his son as he once had, and the guilt that weighed on him every day. Richard had a way of opening up without seeming weak, of revealing the pain that he had kept buried beneath his success. There was a rawness to his vulnerability that surprised Samantha, and she found herself listening closely, understanding the depths of his grief in a way she hadn't expected. "I don't know how to fix it, Samantha. I don't know how to make it right for Alex, or even for myself," Richard admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent so much time building this empire, chasing after success, and I've forgotten what truly matters." Samantha's heart softened at his words. She could hear the loneliness in his voice, the way he was trapped in his own success, isolated by the very wealth that should have set him free. It wasn't just money he was missing. It was connection. It was warmth. It was the human touch that had been taken from him when Lily died. Samantha shifted in her seat, her own insecurities bubbling to the surface. She had been struggling with her own sense of self-worth, wondering if she was doing enough for Ethan, questioning whether this life she was building for him would ever be enough. But in that moment, she realized that Richard's pain was no different from her own. "Maybe it's not about fixing everything right now. Maybe it's about taking it one step at a time," Samantha offered, her voice softer now, more grounded than she had felt in a long time. "You're doing your best, and that's enough. Maybe you just need to open up, to let Alex in again, to show him you're still there, that you haven't given up on him." Richard met her eyes, and for a brief moment there was a silence between them, an understanding that neither of them had words for, but both could feel. They were two people who had been lost in their own grief, their own battles, but somehow, in that fleeting moment, they connected. Two strangers bound by pain, by love, and by the desire to heal. And in that moment, something shifted, possibility, an opening, something neither Samantha nor Richard had expected when their paths crossed in the park. The meal continued, the conversation flowing more easily as the evening wore on, but the undercurrent of something deeper lingered between them, a bond that neither of them had anticipated, but one that was undeniably there. A chance for something new, something better. Something neither of them had been able to find on their own, but maybe, just maybe, they could find together. As the days turned into weeks, Samantha and Richard's connection deepened. They began to spend more time together, initially for short dinners, then longer walks, then quiet moments where they both shared pieces of their lives. They spoke candidly about their experiences, the struggles, the loss, the burden of carrying the weight of their worlds alone. For the first time in a long time, they felt truly seen by each other, not just for their wealth or their circumstances, but for the people they had become through their grief and their determination. But the closer they became, the more insecurities began to surface. Samantha, who had always been independent and self-sufficient, felt herself shrinking in Richard's world. As much as she wanted to believe that she fit into this new reality, the shadow of her self-doubt loomed large. Was she enough for him? Could she ever belong in his world of high society, business deals, and wealth? She was just a single mom, a nurse who worked long hours just to keep her family afloat. Richard, with his polished suit and sophisticated demeanor, seemed like someone from another life. Someone who belonged to a world she didn't know how to navigate. On the other hand, Richard was fighting a different kind of insecurity. Despite his immense wealth and success, he felt exposed. Samantha didn't ask for anything from him. She didn't want his money or his status. That's what made their connection feel so real, but at the same time, it terrified him. Was he just a trophy for her? Was it his wealth that made her stay? Was he enough for her without all the things money could buy? One afternoon, as they sat at a small cafe near the park, the weight of their unspoken fears hung in the air like a storm cloud. Samantha pushed her coffee cup aside, her fingers nervously tracing the rim. "I don't know, Richard. I don't know if I fit in your world," she said softly, her voice tinged with the vulnerability she'd kept hidden for so long. "I'm not like you. I don't know what it's like to walk into a room full of powerful people, to make deals that change the world. I'm just a mom, a nurse. I don't have the kind of life you're used to." Richard's face tightened, the hint of concern in his eyes betraying his usual composure. "You're more than enough, Samantha," he said quickly, reaching across the table to take her hand in his. "Don't you see? It's not about what world you come from. It's about who you are. You make me feel things I haven't felt in years. You make me want to be better, not because of the things I've achieved, but because of the person I am when I'm with you." Samantha pulled her hand back, her heart pounding in her chest. "But your world, it's so different from mine. The press, the business, the constant attention. I can't just step into that. I don't even know if I'm ready to be part of that life." Richard's expression darkened and his voice grew more insistent. "I don't care about the press. I don't care about any of that. What matters is you and me. What matters is what we share. I don't want you to feel like you have to change for me. I want you for who you are, not what you bring to the table." He paused, his gaze searching hers, as though trying to pull her deeper into his world. "I want to build a life with you, not because of what you have or don't have, but because I can't imagine it without you." But Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that their worlds were simply too different. She felt the tension between them growing, like two parallel lines that would never quite meet, no matter how hard they tried. She didn't belong in Richard's world. She couldn't. The tension between them continued to build over the next few days. Both of them tried to fight the growing distance, but their insecurities festered. The moment Richard would slip away to handle a business crisis, Samantha would retreat into herself, questioning everything. Am I just a distraction for him? What if I'm just a phase for him, a fleeting moment before he moves on to someone who fits better into his world? But it wasn't just the quiet doubts that were threatening to tear them apart. There was the external pressure that had been building since their dinner together. The media, always hungry for a story, had caught wind of the connection between Samantha and Richard. The first article appeared in a tabloid, a photo of them together at the cafe, their hands touching, their eyes locked in a moment of intimacy. The headline screamed, "Billionaire CEO falls for single mom. Is she just after his fortune?" Samantha's heart sank when she saw the article. She immediately called Richard, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I knew this would happen. They're making it about the money. They're going to say I'm using you, that I'm just some gold digger looking for a payday." Richard's tone was sharp, but there was a trace of frustration in his voice. "Don't let them get to you, Samantha. They don't know what we have. This isn't about money, it's about us." But the damage was done. The tabloids ran with the story, fueling rumors that began to swirl around them. Samantha's phone started buzzing non-stop with messages. Some from old friends, others from strangers offering their opinions on the relationship. Most were skeptical, and some even cruel. "She's just after his money," one text read. "It's obvious he's being used." Samantha was devastated. She felt exposed in a way she never had before, her life under a magnifying glass. The weight of the media's assumptions, the judgment, and the public scrutiny crushed her spirit. Was that how Richard saw her? Was she really just some pawn in a billionaire's game? The insecurity was like a virus, spreading into her thoughts, poisoning her every move. She pulled away from Richard, avoiding his calls and his attempts to reassure her. Every word he said felt hollow, as though it were just a public relations attempt to save face. Richard, for his part, was seething. He had spent his life controlling the narrative. He had built his empire by making careful decisions, by staying one step ahead of everyone, but with Samantha, he was powerless. The media was relentless, and no matter how much he tried to protect her, they just wouldn't stop. One evening, Richard showed up at her apartment, his jaw clenched, his eyes full of determination. He had had enough of the rumors, enough of the media's invasion of their privacy. He wasn't going to let them tear apart what he had started to build with Samantha. He had to make a choice, and that choice was her. Samantha stood at the door, her arms crossed, her face a mask of exhaustion and frustration. "Richard, please just go. I can't deal with this right now." But Richard stepped inside, his presence filling the room. He wasn't going to back down this time. "No," he said firmly, his voice strong. "I'm not leaving. Not without telling you that this," he gestured to the space between them, the invisible wall that had formed in the last few days, "isn't going to stop me. It's not going to stop us." Samantha's eyes were filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. "But they're right, Richard. They think I'm using you. They think I'm after your money, and I don't know how to convince them I'm not." Richard took a step closer, his hands reaching for hers. "It doesn't matter what they think, Samantha. It doesn't matter what anyone thinks. What matters is what we have. I'm not letting anyone take that away from us. I don't care about the press. I don't care about the rumors. I care about you." He paused, his voice softening. "I'll put my business on the line to protect you, to protect us." Samantha's breath caught in her throat. Richard was offering to sacrifice it all for her, for them. The weight of his words settled in her chest. He wasn't just the CEO of a billion-dollar empire. He was willing to risk everything for love. For her. Richard stood there, his eyes locked on hers, waiting for her response. And in that moment, something inside Samantha shifted. The self-doubt, the fear, the distance, all of it faded into the background. She had to trust him, trust them, even if it meant stepping into a world that terrified her, because this connection, this love, was real. And sometimes, that was all you needed to move forward. "Okay," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "Okay, let's face it together." And as they stood there, hands intertwined, Richard knew that no matter what came next, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, he would fight for Samantha, for their love, and he would protect her from the storm, no matter the cost. Because this was real. This was worth it. And he wasn't going to let anyone take it away. The days after that pivotal moment when Richard stood firm, making it clear that he was willing to risk everything for their relationship, felt like a whirlwind. But for Samantha and Richard, something profound had shifted. What had once felt fragile and uncertain now had a foundation built on mutual respect, love, and vulnerability. They were no longer two separate lives orbiting around their own worlds. They had come together, slowly but surely, learning to trust, to open up, and to fight for something deeper than either of them had ever dared to hope for. The press was relentless, as expected. Headlines and paparazzi followed them, scrutinizing every moment they spent together. But where there was once a sense of fear, now there was only a quiet resilience. Samantha and Richard didn't hide. They embraced the storm, standing firm as a couple. They learned that they didn't need to shield themselves from the world. They just needed to be true to each other, to their love. Samantha's role in Richard's life began to shift in ways she hadn't anticipated. No longer just the single mother with doubts about her place in his world, she started to become a partner, equal, valuable, and irreplaceable. Richard no longer saw her as just someone who had entered his life by accident. He saw her as a woman who had brought something into his world he hadn't known he needed, real human connection. She, in turn, found a new confidence. The self-doubt that had once plagued her began to fade, replaced by the knowledge that she was enough. She had always given so much to Ethan, but now she was beginning to give a little bit of herself to Richard too. And in return, Richard gave her the space to be herself. Flaws, strengths, and all. She wasn't there for his wealth. She was there because they both needed each other, and that was more than enough. The dinner invitations, the date nights, and the quiet evenings at home with Ethan became part of their new rhythm. But even as things began to settle, there was a sense of anticipation in the air, as though something big was just beyond the horizon. And it was. Richard, ever the man of decisions, had something weighing on his heart, something he knew he had to do. It was a crisp evening when it happened. It hadn't happened. Richard had been planning this moment for weeks, consulting with his closest friends, making sure every detail was perfect. But in the end, it wasn't about the details. It wasn't about the lavishness or the extravagance that had always defined his life. This moment, this act, was about something far more meaningful. A promise, a new future, a decision that he and Samantha would build together. They were at the same park where they'd first met Alex, where the world had changed for all of them in an instant. The evening had a quiet stillness to it, and as the sun dipped low, casting a golden light over the path they walked hand in hand, Richard knew this was the right place, the right moment. Samantha had no idea what was coming. They had spent a quiet day together, just the two of them. Ethan was staying with a friend, giving them a rare moment to themselves. Samantha was talking about the upcoming week's challenges, a new shift at the hospital and the pressures of balancing everything. Richard listened intently, but his mind was already somewhere else. Somewhere they would both soon go together. Finally, after walking for a while, Richard stopped, turning toward her. Samantha, lost in her thoughts, only realized he had stopped when she almost bumped into him. She looked up, confused for a moment, but when she saw the expression in his eyes, something tender, something vulnerable, her breath caught in her throat. "Samantha," Richard began, his voice low, steady, "I've spent my life building empires, making decisions, controlling every aspect of my world. But none of that has ever mattered as much as this moment, right now." Samantha's heart fluttered. She had never seen him like this, so unguarded, so open. She stood still, waiting for him to continue. "I don't want a life built on wealth or status. I don't want a future that is defined by the things I've accumulated or the people I've met. I want a future built on something real, something that comes from the heart, with you." Samantha's eyes widened, a mixture of surprise and wonder flooding through her. Her heart raced, her thoughts tangled, but before she could say anything, Richard stepped closer, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small, velvet box, the kind of box she had never imagined she would ever see in her life, especially not with someone like him. He opened the box, revealing a delicate ring, the diamond catching the light in a way that felt almost magical. It wasn't ostentatious, it wasn't a show of wealth. It was simple, elegant, and perfect, just like the love they had built together. "Samantha, will you marry me?" Richard asked, his voice soft but filled with certainty. Samantha closed her eyes, savoring the words, the feeling of being truly cherished for the first time in her life. "I love you too, Richard, and I want the same thing." The days following Richard's proposal were a blur of joy, laughter, and planning. Samantha couldn't stop smiling, couldn't stop thinking about how her life had changed so drastically in such a short amount of time. It was as if a whole new chapter had opened up in front of her, one she never thought she would be able to live. But amidst the whirlwind of excitement, the couple continued to face challenges. The media, of course, was still relentless, though their focus had shifted to the impending wedding. But this time, something had changed within both Samantha and Richard. They weren't just reacting to the noise. They had found something real, something that no tabloid headline could touch. They had each other. Tears welled up in Samantha's eyes. She had dreamed of a day like this for so long, of a love that wasn't defined by her fears, by her insecurities, or by what she had been through. And here it was, standing right in front of her. Richard had become the man she never thought she'd find. A man who understood her, accepted her, and loved her despite everything. She whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. Yes, Richard, I will." Richard's face broke into the most genuine smile she had ever seen. The years of pain, the barriers they had both erected around themselves, seemed to melt away in that moment. He placed the ring on her finger, his hands trembling slightly as he did, as if he couldn't believe what was happening either. They stood there for a moment, both overwhelmed by the significance of what had just transpired. And then, without a word, Richard pulled Samantha into his arms. They held each other close, as if they were the only two people in the world, wrapped in a warmth that neither of them had ever felt before. "I love you," Richard whispered into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." And as for Ethan, he had been nothing short of thrilled at the news. He was so excited that he couldn't sit still, constantly asking when the wedding would happen, what kind of cake they would have, and whether there would be a magician at the party. Richard had taken to spending more time with Ethan, trying to become the father he hadn't been before. Together, they were building something new, something full of hope and promise. On the day of the wedding, Samantha stood in front of the mirror, the soft sound of music filling the room. The dress she wore was simple but elegant, and as she looked at herself, she couldn't help but reflect on the journey she had been on. She had gone from feeling lost and inadequate to standing here, ready to marry the man who had shown her what true love was. Richard stood at the altar, looking every bit the man he had once been, but now softened by the love he had found. As their eyes met, there was no need for words. They had already said everything they needed to say. The ceremony was beautiful in its simplicity, surrounded by friends and family, and with Ethan happily sitting beside Richard. As Samantha and Richard exchanged vows, their hands tightly clasped, they both knew that this was just the beginning. Their future was unwritten, but it was theirs to shape together. As they walked out of the ceremony, hand in hand, with Ethan between them, the sun shone down, casting a warm glow over their new life. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was more than either of them had ever hoped for. And as the scene faded, the message was clear. Love, kindness, and vulnerability had changed everything for them. It had opened their hearts, transformed their lives, and created something that would last beyond the trials they had faced. For Samantha and Richard, the greatest reward wasn't the wealth, the fame, or the status. It was the love they had built, the bond they shared, and the growth they had achieved together. And for the viewers watching their story unfold, the message was unmistakable. Small acts of kindness could change everything, and love had the power to heal and rebuild. Did you believe in love at first sight? What does kindness mean to you? Drop your thoughts below and hit that like button if you believe in second chances. Let us know how love and kindness have shaped your life, because we would love to hear your stories. And don't forget to subscribe. We've been stuck on 1 subscriber since January, and we need your support to reach 1,000 subscribers before the end of February. Your subscription means so much to us and helps us grow this amazing community. Remember, you're not just watching a video, you're part of a positive, supportive community that celebrates love, kindness, and personal growth. We're all in this journey together, and your thoughts, your support, and your presence are what make this channel so special. So if you found inspiration in this story, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with your loved ones. Whether it's a partner, a friend, or someone who could use a little reminder that kindness and love can change everything. Let's keep spreading the positivity and building a community where we uplift each other.